welcome to this PowerServer 2020 sneak peek. This is a preview of the new features introduced in the upcoming PowerServer 2020, the Appian framework for converting automatically with almost zero effort any Power Builder application to the web and the mobile platforms. This is the agenda. Topics covering include the sync with the majority of the new functionality in Power Builder 2019. So OpenOut 2.0 support, sync of missing functionality in HTTP client and RESTClient objects, full support of parsing and packaging of JSON objects, import and export of JSON data in a data window or data store, a handful of API for encoding, encrypting, signing, and hashing of data, and finally compression and extraction of files or binary objects in memory. Last day of Elevate 2019, I've introduced myself several times, so I will skip this slide. Let me start from OAuth 2.0, the open standard for token-based authorization on the internet. For those who are not familiar with it, OpenOut is very popular because it provides authorization flows for web, desktop, and mobile apps. And now you can have built-in support in PowerServer too. OpenOut works by delegating user authentication to the service that hosts the user account, for example, Facebook, Google, PayPal, and authorizing third-party application to access the user account. For instance, in this picture, client asks the Google OAuth server, which will send back the authorization code. Then this authorization code is forwarded by the client to the application, which will send it to the Google Auth again. Google Auth will verify the auth code and will return an access token, which can be then used between the client and the application for any subsequent request and response. So an application doesn't store user credentials, but grant access based on tokens provided by a trusted OAuth server. OAuthClient is the new object in Power Builder in charge of handling the protocol. It allows sending a request to retrieve access token, which are the thing that applications use to make API requests on behalf of a user. So see here the API for the access token methods, which needs you to fill a token request object and returns a token response object, from which you can extract the access token itself. This access token, is also called bearer token because the client must send in the bearer HTTP authorization header when making a request, and the server will give access to the bearer of this token. So for instance, PayPal OAuth endpoint is this one. OAuthClient then lets you send the actual request to get access to a REST resource. And this is done through the request resource method, where you specify the access token in the request and get the resource in the response object. The response, of course, is an HTTP body, and therefore get body is the usual way to access the payload. So this is an example of PowerScript that you can also run from in PowerServer 2020. So you fill the token request object in red with OpenOut endpoint, Twitter in this case, and client ID plus client secret that has been generated by the Twitter developer page when an app for OAuth request is registered. Then you scroll down a little bit, and in green you see the OAuthClient object used to request the access token. This is part of the token response object in blue, which we use to check whether the HTTP response has a body, and if so, we get the access token method in order to fetch the bearer token string. Now we can access the Twitter API by sending a OAuth request object that includes the token. The request resource method will return an OAuth response object with the answer. Let's now go through the two objects for accessing web resources, HTTP and RESTClient. So unlike HTTP client, in PowerServer 2019, RESTClient can only be used for basic retrieve. But in PowerServer 2020, it has been almost totally synced with PowerBuilder, so the retrieve is partially supported. Unsupported functionality are only the token request argument for passing OpenOut access tokens and the compression option. Unsupported are also the get response body, send request, and submit. So essentially the typical use of REST client is for retrieving REST data and present them into a data window. Overall, REST client object is very handy when you need to call a RESTful service and display the results into a data window. Unlike usual data window data sources, RESTful web services are based on actions performed using HTTP methods and returned types specified by the content type HTTP header. So the REST client simplifies programming because it makes it quicker to fill the target data window or data store than the alternate process approach based on HTTP client plus the JSON parts and import. So it loads the JSON data returned by the service, and JSON must of course have a structure that can be loaded into a data window or data store, for example, arrays of columns. And this picture shows a PowerBuilder example converted to PowerServer where a REST service provides employees data at this URL, and the result is automatically parsed out and represented into a data window with data window column names and types that must match names and types in the JSON string, although it is not necessary to have same amount of columns or same order. Unlike HTTP client, in PowerServer 2019, REST client can only be used for basic retrieve. Instead, PowerServer 2020 supports OpenOut 2.0. So both REST client and HTTP client objects take an optional token request argument. You see, the third parameter in the retrieve is now the token request object, which usually comes with client ID and secret. And same if you use the send request for post the request from the HTTP client object to the server. And in the communication, the OpenOut token returned by the server is cached and it is reused on later requests that have matching token requests. Let's go now through the JSON enhancement, and in particular JSON handling from data window. You have plain JSON support, which exports data from the data window primary buffer as a plain JSON string, or data window JSON, which contains in addition elements representing the various aspects of a data window, like column names, filter, delete buffers, or data window childs. Data window JSON has the same capability as the sets full state and get full state traditional data window methods, but instead of proprietary data format, it uses open format, so JSON format. And a summary of the API are here below. When export JSON, you can specify a Boolean for the format, or it is possible to specify also the data window buffer and whether or not only changed data, while importing JSON is as simple as passing the JSON data as first argument. Concerning JSON parsing or generation, the JSON parser object is now available in PowerServer 2020, so you can parse out JSON data from a string or a file. Instead, support of JSON generator gives ability to build a JSON object. And in terms of API, this is just a short list of supported functions. When you parse out JSON data, you can load from string and you can get number of children, a specific child by index, and all gathers depending on whether the value is an integer, is a string, a date, etc., etc. And when you create a JSON object, you can create an object or an array and then add all possible data type in there. And of course, you can do this recursively. The JSON package, whenever you need to transfer JSON data across the network, JSON package object allows you to merge multiple data window data into a single one and then extract them back. Primary use is for faster network performance. With all Power Builder API here, also available in PowerServer, merge individual record sets by setting the values of the sets, get merged JSON as a string or blob, load JSON, or get a JSON provided a specific key name. And this is an example of how you can do in PowerServer 2020 now. You can create a JSON package and merge data window and a data store together, providing each one a name into the package. For example, books and authors. Now you're good to get the overall JSON with getJSON string, and then say into another script on the other side of the wire, load string the JSON into the JSON package, and then use getValue to extract individual JSON, for instance, the authors. Next is a set of utility for encoding, encryption, hashing, and compression. So Power Builder provides a set of new objects for encoding the data, for performing symmetric encryption, asymmetric encryption, asymmetric signing, and hashing, and finally compression. Let me start from the first one. The coder object allows you to encode data. When you encode data, you don't actually encrypt the data. You just change the way it looks like for usually transportability over the network. So there are three methods of encoding blob or string. Hexadecimal, so you have an hexadecimal encode and hexadecimal decode. Base64, which is very useful for sending binary data into the HTTP body. URL encode and URL decode for encoding web URL. Next is symmetric encryption. In this case, you change the way data is transferred, and symmetric encryption is based on a shared key. So the source starts from a plain text. On this plain text, an encryption algorithm is applied, and it produces a ciphertext which can be then decrypted by using the same algorithms and the same shared key. And finally, the plain text can be decoded by the receiver. So PowerServer supports the symmetric encryption method, the symmetric decryption, with a number of algorithms like AES, DES, TDES, etc. etc. Next is the possibility to perform asymmetric encryption. In this case, the communication rely on two keys, public key and private key. They are different keys, but they are tied together by a very strong mathematical relationship. So whenever you want to send a certain text or certain binary data, you will apply an encryption algorithm which is based on the public key. This scrambled data then is received by the receiver, which will apply the decryption on top of the private key that he or she holds secretly. So in PowerServer, you can use the asymmetric generate key methods of the CrypterObject, which allows you to create private key and public key for following data transmission. Asymmetric encryption, which, as you see from the picture, is based on the public key. Asymmetric decryption, which is instead based on the private key. And the algorithms that are supported are the very famous RSA, DSA, and Rabin. You can also perform asymmetric signature, just inverting the role of the public key and the private key. So when you transmit data, when you sign some data, you want to, of course, generate a hash value and then sign this hash value with your private key, just to witness that is signed by you. And then the signed message is sent to the receiver, which will use the public key to decode the hash value and verify the signature. With that respect, in PowerServer you can use the asymmetric sign method of the CrypterObjects, the asymmetric verify sign with private key and public key that perform the roles like in this picture. RSA, DSA, and Rabin are still the three algorithms that you can use with that respect. Another functionality is the possibility to create hashing. So given a certain message, a certain data of arbitrary length, hashing will generate a hash value of fixed length. So it doesn't matter how long it's the message, the hash value will be always of the same size. You can use MD5, HMSC, and SHA with the number of variants of algorithms that are listed here in this box. Next is the possibility to compress objects. You have functions in the compressor objects, and this is compress, which takes a source, a destination, and a format. The source can be a folder name, an array of file names, or a blob data. And the destination out of this compression can be a file name, like a file.zip, or a blob if the source is a blob. Possible formats are zip, 7-zip, gzip, and tar. There is also an event in the compressor object, and events are start, which happen before the compression begins, finished when the compression complete, and processing file, which name of current file being compressed. Sites completed will give you the total number of bytes currently compressed. So you can monitor the compression process and provide, for example, some progress bar. Opposite function is performed by the extractor object. It comes with a method extract, source, destination, and format, and the source can be the compressed file from the compressor object or a blob. The destination can be a folder or a blob, and the format are basically the same as before. So zip, 7-zip, gzip, tar, but also you can extract compressed objects from RAR format, LZMA, and LZMA86. These latest format are not supported by the compressor object. Events, the four events, like 5 events like before, start happens before the compression begins, finish when the compression complete, processing files, size completed, and also errors. Okay, it's time for a demo. Let me start from the environment first. So if I open the web browser and navigate to the Appian Enterprise Manager page, I will see that I'm running PowerServer 2020 build 2190. And Power Builder is release 2019 release 2, which is compliant, which is compatible with PowerServer 2020. It means that from Power Builder 2019 release 2, you can deploy web and mobile applications to PowerServer 2020 as well. So I'm not going to go through the overall installation process of PowerServer and the PowerServer toolkit. If you're interested in how to do that, just have a look at the hands-on PowerServer tutorial from this Elevate 2019. So here I have my application. I will just click on the deploy button and I will select the application to be deployed, Elevate, and to my local host, Microsoft IIS. I will click Next. PowerServer Toolkit will go through 3 steps, export of the source code, generating of the target file, and finally copy the application to the IIS web root. I'm good to go. So I will just close Power Builder. I will open my web browser and will open the Elevate web application. So I will run Power Builder application from within the web browser. Of course, this application has become a PowerServer application. I will start from the REST button here, which shows how easy it is to contact a RESTful service and fill a data window. Once you have the information in the data window, I remind you the RESTClient already parses out the JSON data and matches the data window columns with the JSON key names and the data window columns types with the values into the JSON. You can have, of course, more columns in the data window or more properties in the JSON data. The REST client object will only fill the columns and the properties in the JSON data which are in sync, which have the same column names and same data. You can export some of these rows as a JSON. So I will click on this button and I've selected 3 rows. So 1, 2, and 3. And of course, then I can import these 3 rows back into the data window. So export JSON and import JSON from and to data store data window. Let me move to the HTTP client object. Of course, it provides you full support to access and call any web resource. I will use the same URL. You can see that you get the overall JSON HTTP response. You can extract the body. just see the headers or see again the data window. In terms of JSON manipulation, once you have the data in your data window, you can, for example, generate your own JSON object. Here I just take the first 3 rows, but you see I call the list of rows employees. So this is my custom key, which occurs prior to the begin of the square bracket. Then of course I can parse it out and put it back into the data window. OpenOuth provides you a lot of interesting functionality. So the OAuthClient is now supported in PowerServer 2020. I will play with Twitter a little bit. So here I have the Twitter OAuth endpoint, and I will send a post request providing client ID and the secret, which I got from the Twitter developer page when I've registered my Twitter app. So I will click on this button, get token, which will retrieve the access token from the Twitter OAuth server. And then I will use this token to perform an actual request of a resource. For example, I want to get information from my Twitter homepage. So I will send a get providing in the header the bearer token, same access token that I got before. Click on Get Results and you will see I can get information in JSON format from my Twitter homepage and have multiple Twitter API. For example, I can access a specific post. I can also play with the additional Twitter API. For example, I can get a couple of posts from my page, or I can see whether uh, this guy here is following me or not. And this is again the result. Next, a number of utility that you now have built in PowerServer. So let me start from encoding, and let me put a string here. So I can encode this string, but of course the same applies to a blob data in hexadecimal format. Here is the format, and of course from this hexadecimal format you can get back the original text using the coding, base64 or URL encoding. Symmetric encryption. This test can be encrypted using shared key. So from the plain text, ciphertext, and plain text decrypted using the shared key. Asymmetric encryption. Here I have support for creating both public key and private key. So I start from my text and I will encrypt this text and decrypt it back. I will encrypt using the public key and I will decrypt using the private key. Hashing, MD5 or SHA, HMAC. Doesn't matter how long is the input message. The point of hashing is always providing you a fixed size, a fixed length hash value. And finally, compression. So here I have support for compressing file, a list of files, or a blob data. Let me take some file on my disk. For example, I have this big file here, 7 megabytes. I will open it and I will specify where to compress. And during the compression process, you can monitor so how many data are being compressed. When it is done, you will get the zip file. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I hope you liked the new PowerServer 2020 and the extended set of new functionalities that are now supported. Stay connected with the Appium community on the community sites where you can find discussions, technical articles and videos, and free online training. Follow the Appium roadmap on the social network, and also have a look, visit the Appium HQ channel on YouTube.